This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, as the title suggests and gives it away, I'm here to talk of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, behind-the-scenes stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to talk about in this podcast, they have a mainstream leaning really. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. Too much of that about already. Instead, I'm just trying to celebrate the fact that it's really difficult to make a film, and I just want to salute the people who managed to get it done. That said, this particular episode, I'm taking a slightly different turn with the second of the two films I'm talking about, because I'm going to talk about a movie for the first time on this podcast that didn't get made. But before that, I'm going to talk about one that did. Let me take you back to 1993. I'm going to play you a clip.
I had to come all the way from the highways and byways of Tallahassee, Florida, to Motor City, Detroit to find my true love. If you gave me 1,000,000 years to ponder, I would never have guessed that true romance and Detroit would ever go together. And to this day, the events that followed all seem like a distant dream. But the dream was real and was to change our lives forever. I kept asking Clarence why our world seemed to be collapsing and everything seemed so shitty. And he'd say, "That's the way it goes, but don't forget, it goes the other way too." That's the way romance is. Usually that's the way it goes. But every once in a while, it goes the other way too.
A longer than usual clip there, but then I got the opportunity to play that glorious slice of Hans Zimmer's score to 1993's True Romance, directed by Tony Scott, written by Quentin Tarantino, starring Christian Slater, Patricia Arquette, Dennis Hopper, Val Kilmer, Gary Oldman, Brad Pitt, Christopher Walken, loads and loads of people in this one, of course. The story of it, though, goes back to the 1980s, even before Quentin Tarantino burst onto the scene as arguably the big breakthrough movie talent of the 1990s. That he'd been writing scripts while working. I think this bit of the story is pretty well known. He worked in a video store. His friend Roger Avery, they wrote lots and lots of scripts. One of them that he wrote was True Romance, which he would decree his most autobiographical just in terms of the characters rather than the events. That the lead character in True Romance of Clarence is closest to Tarantino. Now, one of the stories here is that the genesis of True Romance actually lay in a screenplay that had been written by Roger Avery called The Open Road. Now, this was said to be a script that Avery was having trouble with, and so he passed it over to Tarantino to have a go at. Tarantino then wrote a screenplay about 500 pages long, which basically incorporated both True Romance and what would become Natural Born Killers as part and parcel of it. The idea was then there was talk about doing some kind of miniseries or something with it, but ultimately they decided to split it, and True Romance became a screenplay in its own right. There was a point too, and at this point Tarantino hadn't had a single one of his films optioned or made, that William Lustig was going to come in and direct it, the director of Maniac Cop. Now, meanwhile, Tony Scott was going through, director Tony Scott, I mean, he'd hit big with Top Gun. Then at the start of the 1990s, both Revenge and Days of Thunder had struggled to varying degrees. He moved on to make a film called The Last Boy Scout, written by Shane Black, which was not a fun film to make, but would go on to be a more successful one. Yeah, on the set of The Last Boy Scout, one of the things about Tony Scott was he always said to have an open door to people who were trying to break in. And one of the people at that point trying to break into the film industry was, of course, Quentin Tarantino. Now, by whatever circumstances, I couldn't quite find out, but Tarantino got himself an invite to see The Last Boy Scout being made. And whilst there, he was said to have quizzed Tony Scott an awful lot about how to direct a film, about why he was choosing different shots, etc., etc. And Scott was really quite taken with him, to the point where he invited him to a party afterwards, and they talked about screenplays. Now, Tarantino had two available at that time. He had Reservoir Dogs and True Romance. Tony Scott read them both on a transatlantic flight, and he wanted to do them both, but Tarantino asked him to pick one with the view that he would then go and direct the other. And an interview with the Rewatchables podcast went into this a little bit, that there was a point where True Romance was going to be financed with William Lustig's production company, but at the point that that Tony Scott chose True Romance, the option was bought out from Lustig's production company, and thus Scott was going to direct True Romance, Tarantino was going to direct Reservoir Dogs. There was a point where Tony Scott wanted to make both of them. Now, there was an article that appeared in Maxim 15 years after the release of True Romance, which brought a lot of the key players back together. And obviously, Tony Scott isn't with us anymore, sadly, tragically. But he told Maxim at the time that when he was directing The Last Boy Scout, my assistant was hanging out with this quirky guy named Quentin Tarantino. He'd be around the set, and she said, "You've got to read the script." Tarantino, for his part, said that when you're a nobody, it's murder to get anyone to read your scripts. So his thing at that point was make the first page, quote, fantastic, with dialogue that grabbed you right away. So the original script of True Romance, he described, started with a long conversation about how do I put this tastefully in a family podcast. Let's go with using your facial talents to arouse someone else without necessarily using words. I think we can get that. So that was what the original script of True Romance, that's what the opening originally looked like. And Tarantino said to Tony Scott, read the first 3 pages. If you don't like it, throw it away. The script was ultimately bought for $50,000, which was the minimum rate that the Writers Guild of America at the point would allow. And True Romance was now on a fast track to being made. Production company Morgan Creek, which had just had a huge hit with Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Morgan Creek was involved, and the project would ultimately be set up at Warner Brothers, who again had distributed Robin Hood as part of the Morgan Creek deal. So Scott saw an assortment of things in this. I mean, he was a huge fan of Terrence Malick's Badlands, and I think listening to that Hans Zimmer piece of music at the start of this podcast, well, if you listen to the score to Badlands, you can see the homage writ large there. But also, it then came to casting, and casting was where Tarantino and Tony Scott had slightly different ideas. That for the key role of Clarence, Tarantino had in mind Robert Carradine, but it was Christian Slater to whom Tony Scott sent the screenplay. Now, Slater at this point in the early 90s, he'd been part of Robin Hood as it happened, but it sprung up really in a couple of cult films as much as anything else. The Brilliant Heathers, the Brilliant Pump Up the Volume, films that had their audience but hadn't really gone fully mainstream. The Name of the Rose as well in there as well. But the talk of Slater in the late 80s and early 90s was of the next Jack Nicholson. As such, he was being sent an assortment of interesting things to consider. Now, there was a story too that in the early days, convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein, through his Miramax empire, was interested in funding this one, or at least being involved in it. But it was the casting of Christian Slater, goes the story, that put him off, that he would rather have had someone along the lines of Steve Steve Buscemi, and Warner Brothers and Harvey Weinstein parted company over the movie as a result of that casting decision. For Slater's part, he was in the midst of making the underrated Weepy, actually, Unchained Heart at that point. And True Romance was something of a turn for him. He was certainly interested in it. He met with Tony Scott. The two got on and he landed the role. Scott, for his part, told Slater to watch Taxi Driver, starring Robert De Niro, of course, Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, by way of preparation. Again, it's a pretty well-known story that Slater and Scott saw the role slightly differently, and that would ultimately come across in Slater's portrayal, that it did veer slightly away from how Scott had envisaged the part. For the crucial role of Alabama, well, Quentin Tarantino was said to have Joan Cusack in mind, the brilliant Joan Cusack in mind for that. Meanwhile, Tony Scott was said to be leaning towards Drew Barrymore, but as Patricia Arquette, who ultimately landed the part, would tell Maxim in that feature I just mentioned before, Drew Barrymore was said to be unavailable at that point. Other names that were in the mix, well, it was apparently quite a long search to get the person for Alabama. Jennifer Jason Leigh, Uma Thurman, Bridget Fonda, Kyra Sedgwick, Diane Lane in there as well, possibly Juliette Lewis. I mean, even today, lots of names are bandied around as nearly getting that role, and how close any of them came is subject for debate. But Patricia Arquette got hold of the script, and she was put off by parts of it, that there was concerns over the racism in the screenplay. But she pressed ahead and had a meeting with Tony Scott, and I mean, there's no easy way to put this, so I'm going to do it as delicately as possible. Going back to what Tony Scott told Maxim of the point where Patricia Arquette and Christian Slater met for the first time, we met with Patricia, and Christian had let's just say, a slight movement in his trousers from the first time he saw her. That made my life a lot easier, said Scott. The viewer believing they're in love comes from their chemistry. Patricia fell in love with Christian and he with her. They had a true romance. And again, a pretty well-known story that the pair did, the romance that we see on screen did extend off screen for a short period of time. Arquette threw herself into the research for the role of Alabama. I think she's brilliant in this film, just brilliant. And she spent several weeks with sex workers as part of just trying to get that role right. But in the midst of the whole casting process, let's go back to Quentin Tarantino, because even though he was relatively hands-off with True Romance, he had indeed gone off and made Reservoir Dogs in the time it had taken True Romance to get this far. And the buzz was beginning to build up about a film that he was going to take to the Sundance Film Festival, Reservoir Dogs. When it premiered and became a sensation, Tarantino was suddenly a filmmaker that lots of actors really, really wanted to work with. Larry Taylor wrote a book on Tony Scott where he talked about that and how it was the newfound reputation of Tarantino as this hot new talent that brought people like Dennis Hopper and Christopher Walken to the movie. Val Kilmer, he wanted in. I mean, he wanted to play the role of Clarence, and off his own back he sent in audition recordings of him reading the role. I mean, he'd worked with Tony Scott on Top Gun. Scott actually saw him more in the Elvis part in the film, although it wouldn't be a full-on Elvis due to permissions from the Elvis Presley estate. As it turned out, we wouldn't actually even see Val Kilmer in focus in the movie, which he briefly addresses in his memoir. Also keen to join the ensemble of this one was an upcoming young actor by the name of Brad Pitt. He was destined for movie stardom even at this stage, but he'd broken through off the back of a supporting role in Thelma and Louise, and he was being sent lots and lots of lead roles for movies, but he approached the True Romance production and asked if he could take the role of Floyd. As it would turn out, when it came to shooting the role of Floyd, Brad Pitt pretty much improvised the lot of it as well, but he wanted to be part of it. And all of a sudden, what you had, and this was unusual for a Tony Scott production, was a movie that was balancing a lot of upcoming new talent with a lot of experienced talent as well, whereas Scott previously had kind of veered one way or the other. It would, as it turned out, be bliss for Tony Scott, as it happened, that his difficulties working with Bruce Willis on The Last Boy Scout were bubbling up in the Hollywood press at the time, and he found the production of True Romance far, far more to his liking. And there are umpteen reports of him just being sat in the middle of the shoot, chomping at his cigar, putting this movie together all around him, and pretty much having the time of his life doing so. But we're jumping just slightly ahead, because by the time True Romance was ready to start filming on the 21st of September 1992, with this incredible cast assembled, well, Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs was on the verge of finally getting its US release off the back of 10 months of chatter following its debut at the Sundance Film Festival. So there was interest in this movie. It's a modestly budgeted film, True Romance, despite that cast list. It would cost about $12.5 million to make, and it would primarily shoot as well on location rather than in studios. There are only a couple of major sets that were built for this one: the trailer where Dennis Hopper's character lives, and the motel room, well, for a sequence that I won't spoil here. What Tony Scott and his production team would instead do was they would shoot in the Detroit and Los Angeles area in the US for the vast bulk of the sequences in there. One setting is worth noting that Tony Scott did introduce that wasn't in Tarantino's original screenplay, and it's quite a loyal a recreation of Tarantino's screenplay that Tony Scott ultimately brought to film. I'll come to that in a little bit. But the roller coaster sequence that you get, much to the displeasure of actors Michael Rappaport and Bronson Pinchot, was Scott's idea that for a particular deal that goes down in the film, he was looking for a slightly different place where he could stage it, and he came up with a theme park, and thus two actors who didn't really like going on roller coasters were sent around on a roller coaster. There's one story from the shooting of this that I didn't like, really, and again this has been discussed, but well, it centres around the way that Tony Scott directed Patricia Arquette in the movie. That the story came out, and Arquette reportedly asked for this, but even so, I don't have her on this podcast to put her side of the story. That Tony Scott would occasionally slap her before shooting a scene, which became so regular that Arquette would go up to Tony Scott and ask for what was described as a persuader before shooting heavy scenes that were coming later in the production. And as Tony Scott reportedly quipped, it's called the English School of Directing. So slightly more positively, we come to Gary Oldman playing the role of Drexel in the movie. Now, Oldman hadn't seen the script of this one before he agreed to sign up to make the movie. He'd coming off the back of films such as JFK at this point and Bram Stoker's Dracula. And he said, I hadn't read the script, I knew nothing about it, that Tony Scott took him for a cup of tea at the Four Seasons Hotel and said, I can't really explain the plot, but Drexel's a pimp who's white but thinks he's black. And Oldman signed up off the back of that one-line pitch to him. But he really threw himself into giving the character of Drexel some distinction as well, that he got his own wig maker in from his work on Bram Stoker's Dracula to sort his hair out and give him such a particular hair look in the movie. He also apparently used one of the eyes that he'd used in Bram Stoker's Dracula as well. And then there's Sol Rubinek, who was cast in the role of Leo. Now, Tony Scott had a particular idea for the character of Leo in that he wanted to model him on producer Joel Silver, with whom Scott had worked before. And Joel Silver, a bit of a reputation as a Hollywood producer, when Robert Zemeckis came to make the film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and they needed for an early sequence in that movie someone to play a rampaging Hollywood producer just shouting off. Well, after seeing lots and lots of actors for that particular role, someone came up with the suggestion, why don't you just cast Joel Silver? And Joel Silver was duly cast in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Apparently he didn't quite warm to his veiled portrayal in True Romance quite as much, and the story was that he and Tony Scott didn't talk for a little while afterwards, although ultimately would make it up. James Gandolfini, meanwhile, he got his break into the movie courtesy of the role that Tom Sizemore didn't want to play. That Sizemore didn't want to play the character who ultimately beat up Patricia Arquette's Alabama in the movie, and he recommended Gandolfini come in and play that role long before Tony Soprano came along, and he duly took his place in the ensemble as well. Now, Slater and Arquette were getting closer and closer throughout the filming of this one. Slater would also admit he was in a relationship at the time, but as he told Maxim in the aftermath, he said, we both made attempts to be professional, but at that age it was difficult. Certainly made half-decent tabloid fodder at that point. One of the most infamous scenes in True Romance, though, is the meeting between Dennis Hopper and Christopher Walken's character. And two masterful actors really going head-to-head. And the way Tony Scott shot this was he did Dennis Hopper's half of the conversation one day, and then he flipped it all round, and Christopher Walken shot his afterwards. But Walken apparently watched what Hopper was doing. He sat and saw the filming of Dennis Hopper's part of the conversation and duly adjusted his performance to match it. And finally on the shoot, I mean, I should quote from Val Kilmer's book, I'm Your Huckleberry, about coming in to play Elvis. He said, as it turned out, I was cast as Elvis, but I was barely seen. In this film, Elvis's face would never appear, and he was not to be called Elvis. His name was Mentor. That apparently Priscilla Presley had given her tentative approval at first to the appearance of an Elvis Presley character, but pulled out because of the violence in the film, which was a concern and something that would dog it at following release as well. And so Kilmer writes, though I dressed in Elvis costumes and assumed Elvis' trademark twang, I only popped in for short, faceless appearances when Christian Slater needed moral support. Kilmer asked, would I have preferred to don my guitar, shake my pelvis and break into blue suede shoes? Hell yes, but a shadow Elvis is better than no Elvis at all, so I thank Tony Scott and remain grateful for the chance to play, in whatever form, the Forever King. By the time filming wrapped up in December 1992, Tarantino fever again was in full swing. I know I repeat that a little bit, but it is worth noting just the head of steam that was building up. Tarantino at this point was starting to put together his next project, which would be something called Pulp Fiction. Wonder what happened to that. But True Romance, even though he wasn't directing it, was seen as the next Tarantino production. At the same time, Oliver Stone was noodling with making Natural Born Killers, which he ultimately would. Let's just say that for the purposes of this podcast, Tarantino was less keen on that one, how that one turned out, but I'll tell that story another time. Now, heading into post-production, the music was a slight problem, because going back to the Elvis Presley estate, I mean, it wasn't just that Tony Scott wanted the character of Elvis on screen, he wanted Elvis Presley tracks to be used in the movie as well, but the Presley estate nixed that idea. There was talk at one point about using Sinatra music as well, but the violence in the script kept coming up as a problem. When Scott ultimately assembled his cut of the film, though, the only real thing that he changed from Tarantino's screenplay was the ending of the movie. Now, without giving away particular spoilers, Tarantino had written a slightly darker denouement to True Romance than the version that Tony Scott ultimately put on screen, that Scott felt it should have a lighter ending than Tarantino had originally envisaged. On reflection, when he finally saw the film, Tarantino would see that he felt Tony Scott had called this one right. And there had been some toing and froing on it, that Tarantino admitted he'd had conversations with Scott where he'd accused him of selling out and he tried to pull all the Hollywood stuff on him. But Tony Scott stood fast and said this is the ending that it should be. And in the end, Tarantino would ultimately approve of it. In fact, Tarantino would have nothing ultimately but nice words about True Romance when he saw the final cut of the movie. It's worth noting he wasn't on the set of this one. He did let Tony Scott go off and make his film, that his screenplay and the way he'd have put it together, he would have mixed the chronology of it, whereas Tony Scott reordered it and would present the narrative of the film in sequential order rather than chopping it around. I think Tarantino said that's really the only thing that he would look at doing slightly differently. In theory, though, this was a film that was heading to a happy ending, that the production had gone well. Quentin Tarantino was happy, Tony Scott was happy. There was just a small matter now of, could a major movie studio sell a slightly offbeat crime thriller and romance of the ilk of True Romance? And not wishing to delve deep into spoilers here, let's just say no, they couldn't. Warner Brothers really struggled to put this movie across, that, as Tony Scott would tell Maxim, we had test screenings of the film in Orange County, and at this point Christian Slater was a date movie star, so our focus group was a little miscast. I mean, he'd made Untamed Heart, that was the film he'd made coming into this, remember. 2/3 of the theatre emptied when Gary blew away Sam Jackson, and the rest left when Christian blew away Gary. Warner Brothers had a problem. The test screenings were not going well. At one point, it even looked at changing the name of the film to Reckless Hearts rather than True Romance to sell it less overtly as a love story. But Tarantino and Tony Scott hatched a plan that if they did that, they'd go into the press junkets and say they hate the title and would name the person in the marketing department who'd made them change it. In a brighter note, just as the film hit its release date of September the 10th, 1993 in the US, it would follow, it's only a month or so later in the UK, if memory serves. The reviews were on the positive side, that a lot of the critics were pulling the film up for its violence, and there's no way around that really. Not everybody warmed to that, but the style of it, the dialogue, the crackle of it really was going over rather well, and so the critical response to it was pretty decent. The box office response to it was not. That Warner Brothers had positioned the movie for, it's September releases in the 1990s. That's not prime box office time. That I've said before on this podcast. We're in an era now where you can release a film at any time with a big enough marketing campaign and get a 9-figure box office gross. September was for smaller movies, just ahead of when award season stuff would start to come in. And this was perhaps demonstrated by the films that True Romance found itself up against. The new releases that week were The Real McCoy, starring Kim Basinger, Undercover Blues with Kathleen Turner and Dennis Quaid in the lead roles of that one. Modest studio movies, really. I mean, as it turned out, the three of them didn't stand a chance because The Fugitive was still packing them in 6 weeks after its release, and it was that topped the box office the week that True Romance came out in the US. That The Fugitive was in first place with $8.3 million. Second place was Undercover Blues, which outgrossed True Romance with a $4.3 million opening. True Romance opened on 1,254 screens in the US with $4 million in the can. The Real McCoy was in fifth place, if you were interested. Disney also released Money for Nothing that particular week and started its slow rollout of the film The Joy Luck Club as well. Bottom line though, True Romance had not found its audience on the big screen, and in fact its box office take in the end, it barely covered the budget. That the film would gross just shy of $13.1 million worldwide. I mean, it did even worse overseas, really. And here we had this film that had been talked about so much in the build-up to its release that just hadn't carried over. Now, in certain stories, that would pretty much be that. But there was a tail to this one, fueled in part really by problems that distributor Polygram was having in the UK with the release of Reservoir Dogs on video. That here in the UK, Reservoir Dogs was held back on video release for an awfully long time in response to concerns over the violence in movies that were, they were just freely viewable in the home, if you believe some of the tabloid fodder at the time. That basically films on video were being seen by people who shouldn't be watching films underage, which is a terrible thing, and there's no way I'd ever endorse anyone watching films underage, governor. As it would happen, of course, there's no better publicity for a movie than someone telling you can't watch it, because then you have to watch it. And it wasn't just Reservoir Dogs that was swept up in this. True Romance for a while had its video release from Warner Brothers held back in the UK. By the time it was ultimately made available to buy, it came with a sticker that Warner Brothers put on it saying the first Tarantino available to own. Pulp Fiction had spiked, and the crucial difference between Reservoir Dogs and True Romance and Pulp Fiction was they'd all been acclaimed, but Pulp Fiction had made a huge amount of money and found a much bigger audience, and that audience then went back and sought out other films by whoever this Quentin Tarantino bloke would be. As such, True Romance has enjoyed a tail and a half on video. It's had special edition DVDs, it had Blu-ray release, and it keeps getting regular screenings when cinemas are open. Furthermore, Scott and Tarantino would work together again, just on the quiet really, that when Scott went on to make the film Crimson Tide, which I covered before, he brought in Quentin Tarantino to do some dialogue rewrite work on that. One tale of True Romance as well is Brad Pitt's character would go on to inspire the movie Pineapple Express a good decade and a half later on. But the thing with True Romance is it's one of those films that was a box office disappointment. There's no way of reframing that at all. It just made far less than all had hoped. It came out from Warner Brothers. It had the backing of a studio behind it. It had the backing of Morgan Creek behind it, but it just didn't carry over into audience appeal. Well, not straight away, because that's the thing about a film. As directors often say in the aftermath of a film not going so well, films do tend to hang around for an awfully long time. I think with True Romance, that has been proven many, many times over. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. This episode is sponsored again by the wonderful folks at Mutiny Shaving, an ethical shaving company who've been hugely supportive of the Film Stories project. You can find them at www.mutinyshaving.co.uk. Their Twitter handle is at Mutiny Shaving. They have a posh hashtag, which I still don't have, which is hashtag Join the Mutiny. And they have been really supportive of Film Stories, and their investment in what we're doing is allowing us to give lots of new writers, well, even more new writers, a break and give them some paid work. So do please go out and support Mutiny Shaving if you can, even if you don't need a shave. I don't mind. One further request too before I launch into the second half of this podcast. I'm an independent podcast producer. I sit in a room by myself. I don't have a big company or marketing budgets or posh things like that. I'm here because of your word of mouth, really. If you do like this podcast, please do subscribe at your podcast home of choice. And if you can ideally leave a hugely positive review as well, that helps me enormously. Just at the point this podcast is being recorded, I'm putting the finishing touches to the latest issue of Film Stories magazine. You'll be able to find out all about that at store.filmstories.co.uk. Depending when you're listening to this, it might have already gone. Who knows? But I think that's probably enough plugging and waffling just for the minute. I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode, with the slight twist that the second one didn't actually end up being made a film at all. But it nearly did. Let me play you a trailer from a video game, and I'll pick the story up the other side of this.
A man has a choice. I chose the impossible. I built a city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the great will not be constrained by the small, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality. I chose to build Rapture. But my city was betrayed by the weak. So I ask you, my friend, if your life were the prize, would you kill the innocent? Would you sacrifice your humanity? We all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us.
Crikey, that's sinister, isn't it? I have two responses to that clip. Number one, that sounds like an amazing video game, which ultimately it was, and a very cinematic sounding one as well. And also, all that running water really made me need a wee. Anyway, that's a clip from the 2007 game Bioshock, published by Take-Two Entertainment, or 2K Games, the label they put it out under. It was developed by a company, by its development studio 2K Boston, that was ultimately changed its name to Irrational Games. And the idea of Bioshock was based on a concept by a man called Ken Levine. We'll be talking about him in a minute. Now, the game itself was set in 1960 in an underwater city, as you can hear from that clip, by the name of Rapture, and it arrived on PCs and games consoles to rich acclaim. It won awards, and to this day, its reputation just remains really, really strong. I remember playing it, and there's a narrative moment in the game which I still think is absolutely ingenious, which I'm definitely not going to spoil. Bioshock was a very quick hit. It sold, about 2 million copies within a year, which was a lot by the standards of 2007 video games. A sequel was very quickly announced in 2008. That game wouldn't come around till 2010, but in between, quite a lot happened. Because it's not just me that thought that sounded a bit cinematic. Lots of people thought that this was going to be the one that broke the infamous curse of the video game movie. Although, hasn't Detective Pikachu put that argument to sleep? Don't know. We'll leave that to you to debate. Now, rumours that Bioshock would be turned into a game started circling in early 2008. And the touch point there was the technology and the visual aesthetic that Zack Snyder had employed on the film 300, which was a monster hit. Never forget how big a hit that was. And there's a feeling that the fictional world of Rapture could be brought to life using using similar tools. The first director whose name was linked with a Bioshock movie was none other than the mighty Guillermo del Toro, but he was also equally quick to deny it. He told IGN at the time, "I'm a big fan of Bioshock, but I'm not involved in creating any movie out of it," although he did add a tease at the end, "Not yet." Now, running alongside this, let's have a chat about Universal Pictures, because at this point it was a studio that was struggling to find a franchise really that would stick. That whilst the Bourne movies did well for Universal in the 2000s, they were coming to an end, and it was on the hunt for new franchises, and it invested a significant amount of money and resources in trying to bring Microsoft's hit Xbox game Halo to the big screen. Now, the deal that Microsoft demanded for Halo was infamous. Lots of studios looked at it and just thought there's no way to make money out of this. That Microsoft wanted basically a movie star deal for the rights to Halo, $5 million up front, 10% of the takings, not the profit. But Universal, it needed a hit, and it saw the potential in it, and thus it partnered with 20th Century Fox to be able to afford to do the film in the first place, although it didn't ultimately happen. What had happened was that Peter Jackson and an upcoming director at that point by the name of Neil Blomkamp had spent about a year trying to develop it and trying to bring Halo to the screen, and the shadow of its ultimate failure was one that hovered over the potential for a Bioshock film. Now, as such, when a deal was ultimately brokered to bring Bioshock to the movies, Take-Two Entertainment's executive chairman, he brokered a deal that he told Variety in 2008 was structured so that Bioshock wouldn't end up in turnaround like Halo. That was the big fear. As they said at the time, the reason I structured it the way I did is to make sure it gets made. But it wasn't going to be a cheap film to make. It had that hallmark of very easy to make movies involved with it. For a start, water. The entire city of Rapture is underwater. Technology was nowhere at the point where when it got to for Aquaman, for instance, where you could do a water film without actually using much water. If you were going to have a city that was underwater, something aquatic was going to have to get involved. Universal made Waterworld. Universal knew all about this. Nonetheless, it won out in the battle for the rights to the film, and it struck a deal with Take-Two to bring it to the screen. And at the point the deal was announced in a Variety report on May the 8th, 2008, so around a year after the release of the video game, it wasn't that it secured the rights to do it, it also announced a director as well, that Gore Verbinski, who was hugely in demand off the back of his success with the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy that he'd directed, well, he signed on to direct the Bioshock movie. This was a huge coup. That there was talk about Pirates of the Caribbean 4 at that point, and Verbinski was the incumbent. He was naturally linked with doing that, and the assumption was he would go and do that. Furthermore, he's developed a film that I've talked about on a Film Stories podcasting before, an animated movie of his own called Rango that he was developing at the time and ultimately making with Paramount Pictures. But he really wanted to do Bioshock. John Logan, written Gladiator, fresh off the success doing script writing for Martin Scorsese's The Aviator. He was brought in to write the script for Bioshock, and the idea was that as soon as Logan's script was done, this movie was going to head into production. That deal was brokered to get this made, remember. Ken Levine was involved as well. Take-Two had sign-off on director. They had approval on it. Levine and Gore Verbinski got on really well. The runes got even better as well, because when Logan did complete the script, pre-production did get underway, that this film was motoring forward. But one thing that was being overlooked, or at least it wasn't in the first few paragraphs of reports at the time, was the tone that the film was going to have to adopt, because Bioshock is a harsh game. It's the 2000s, that decade in the 2000s, perhaps up to the mid-2010s, was Hollywood at the worst of its PG-13 obsession as well. You needed a PG-13 or a 12A certificate, otherwise a film just absolutely couldn't make money. That was seemed to be the given. Bioshock involves very, very creepy characters called Little Sisters injecting substances, and that's hardly the stuff of Disney Plus, is it? Although it might make it to Disney Plus Star, in fairness. But there was no way, looking at the game, that anyone could realistically say that's going to be anything other than an R rating. Combined with the fact that this was going to take 9 figures to bring to the screen, all of a sudden this looked like a far bigger risk than it had seemed when the deal was first announced. The deal, after all, it wasn't at Halo level, but it was a rich one. It cost Universal a pretty penny. That it was a multi-million-dollar deal that it agreed with Take-Two, and also gave Take-Two gross points on the box office return as well. This was not going to be cheap, and Universal wouldn't take home all the profits. Still, there was confidence. Gore Verbinski, in August of 2008, was signed up by Universal to do a three-picture deal. So it wasn't, and this was 3 months after the announcement of Bioshock. So it wasn't just that he was going to make one film for the studio, that it had sufficient confidence just to set up several projects with him there. It was going ahead. There was talk of a 2010 release date for the movie. It was going to be one of Universal's big blockbusters for that year. But I don't think I'm giving much of the game away here to say that Gore Verbinski's 3-picture deal with Universal Pictures would ultimately result in Gore Verbinski making no pictures for Universal Pictures, because around Universal, the movie ecosystem was shifting again. Even as Bioshock was being announced in 2008, after all, just look at the stuff that was heading up the box office then. The Dark Knight, Iron Man, Indiana Jones 4, the rise of the comic book movie and superhero film, and the beginning really of its utter dominance of the box office was beginning there. But also Indiana Jones went to the fact that big franchise cinema was the way forward. The one standout, if you like, original movie was Hancock, and that was a superhero film as well. 2009, it was the films heading the box office were Avatar, Transformers, Harry Potter. One of those, a hugely expensive gamble, of course, but Transformers and Harry Potter mitigated by the cloak of a franchise once more. Hollywood was realising in this era, this was the crucial difference, I think, that movies could cross $1 billion at the global box office, that they could edge towards that amount of money. And all of a sudden, shooting for 300 million when a film was costing a fair amount of money to make, well, that just seemed on the low side. The one I think also that was pretty transformative and was certainly blamed a lot for what we're about to discuss was another Zack Snyder film, because if 300 had been a movie that opened studios' eyes, well, his take on Watchmen was one that closed an awful lot of them as well. Watchmen cost 130 odd million dollars to make. It was R-rated. This was no pandering at all to a family audience with this one. It had an enormous blue member for a start. It was the 31st highest grossing film of that year at the American box office with $107 million, behind Paranormal Activity, directly behind Paranormal Activity in the chart. And that showed you where Hollywood minds were going. The comedy Couples Retreat, which in fairness, very few people remember, but it made more profit than Watchmen. Now, Watchmen has had an afterlife on DVD, on Blu-ray, on 4K, and also a spin-off, a TV adaptation has come of the original comic book since as well. But at this point in 2009, well, all of a sudden, an R-rated movie costing over $100 million to make looked like an enormous gamble with precious little upside. It didn't help that this was the era where Universal's big budget bets just weren't paying off. The third Mummy film didn't do great business, did okay. Its second attempt at bringing Hulk to the screen with The Incredible Hulk, that didn't massively pay off, did pretty much the same as the first attempt. Michael Mann's Public Enemies, that wasn't on the cheap side, that didn't break through. Remember Land of the Lost, big things were hoped for that, a big family live action movie, just pretty much petered out at the box office. All of these big bets that Universal were making were just falling short, and there was precious little good news at the studio. And against this backdrop, after that big initial announcement that the Bioshock film was coming in 2008, things just went quiet for a little bit. In the midst of it, Gore Verbinski was linked to doing a new adaptation of the Cluedo board game, Clue, and then he was targeted again to direct Pirates of the Caribbean 4. That producer Jerry Bruckheimer was keen to get that franchise back up and running after the closure of the original trilogy, and it was very open about the fact he wanted Gore Verbinski to direct it. However, in April 2008, 2009, in a big shot in the arm for the Bioshock movie, Gore Verbinski formally turned Pirates of the Caribbean 4 down, issuing a statement saying how much he loved the franchise, but he wanted to try one or two other things. And at the start of April 2009, it just looked like things were moving forward after all. By the end of April 2009, mere weeks afterwards, everything was back in limbo. Variety issued a report that Universal Pictures had put the brakes on the Bioshock movie. It put the brakes on the Bioshock movie in spite of the fact that pre-production work was well underway. And I asked Gore Verbinski about this once, and he said at that stage we'd started building sets. We'd just started building them. We were pre-vising some sequences. This film was a bit of the way down the road. In fact, auditions were already underway for the cast as well. Recently, at the start of 2021, Jamie Dornan and Eddie Redmayne have revealed to The Hollywood Reporter that they both auditioned for the movie. But the problem Universal was facing was that the budget was ballooning. The cost of this film was now heading towards $160 million, and it was just too rich for their blood. Universal, it's not that it panicked, it just decided to follow what it had done with Robin Hood, shut it down for a bit, see if you can reconfigure it, see if you can bring the price down. Straight away, that meant some of the production staff on Bioshock were laid off. Gore Verbinski was still involved though at this point, but he was faced with the challenge of realising Bioshock and realising Rapture on a much smaller budget. Against this, there were also rumours that the studio was pressuring for a PG-13 rating, and it was just 8 weeks before filming was due to begin that the pause button was pressed. Furthermore, the economies Universal were looking for, they were drastic. If the budget had ballooned to $160 million at this point, the film's price reportedly had to come down to close to $80 million. It had to halve, a hefty cut. And Verbinski, in a Reddit AMA he did for, I think it was for A Cure for Wellness, he said, "We were 8 weeks prior shooting when the plug was pulled. It's an R-rated movie. I wanted to keep it R-rated. I felt like that would be appropriate, and it's an expensive movie. It's a massive world we're creating, and it's not a world we can simply go to locations to shoot." And that was the problem. They could hardly rock up in New York or London or my beloved Birmingham, point cameras and say, "Hey up, that's Rapture." So stylised was the look of the game, so stylised was the underwater city, that this was going to involve at the cheapest extensive set construction on sound stages. There's no way around it. So Universal had another tactic, and as Verbinski told Variety, "We were asked by Universal to move the film outside of the US to take advantage of a tax credit. We're evaluating whether this is something we want to do. In the meantime, the film is in a holding pattern." Now, as Robin Hood went through this holding pattern and came out the other side, and that film went before the cameras, it was worth believing what was said at the bottom of that Variety report. "All parties vow that Bioshock will not become another Halo, the would-be live-action adaptation of the Microsoft game that was cancelled when Universal and Fox got cold feet over budget fears." But there was no doubt whatsoever that Universal was getting cold feet, and the problems were mounting. So let's move just slightly later into 2009. And Verbinski himself, well, he got wet feet now as well. Notwithstanding the fact that Logan's script was done, it was the push to shoot the film outside of America that created a clash in his schedule. Because by this stage, he was deep into working on Rango for Paramount, and he needed to be in the US to be able to complete that film. Verbinski would lament, "Big movies are just not being shot in the States." At the time, he said, "I'm weighing whether I can physically go to the UK or Australia or one of those other places with a tax rebate for a year and a half." He had to conclude with his commitment to Rango, he just couldn't. That said, he was hardly departing the project altogether. He stayed on board as a producer of the film, and it was a few months, but it's still relatively quickly that another director's name came to the fore. Now, Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, he'd come to prominence off the back of the film Intacto, but he'd crossed over into English language filmmaking with the sequel 28 weeks later. I think it's fair to say to an awful lot of us, 28 weeks later was a really pleasant surprise, a much better sequel than we'd been expecting. was the follow-up to the Danny Boyle film 28 Days Later, and when Boyle announced he wasn't going to direct the follow-up, it was just like, well, okay, that smells a bit cashing. But actually, Fresnadillo delivered a good film. So on August the 23rd, 2009, Variety reported that he was now the new director of the Bioshock movie. And this was, again, seen as confirmation that Universal was still making the film. But it was also confirmation, to reading between the lines, that it was not intending to make the film in the US. But stumbling blocks kept coming, and a pivotal one was built into that contract. Remember that all that time ago? Built into that contract that would ensure the film got made was a clause that gave Take-Two director approval. Now, on the surface, few were going to argue with Fresnadillo, but Ken Levine had had a really good relationship with Gore Verbinski, and he didn't hit it off in quite the same way with the new director. The air of this one was coming out of the tyres. There was another external force that hardly helped it as well, because in 2010, another big blockbuster video game adaptation made it to the big screen. There were high hopes for the Jerry Bruckheimer produced film based on the Prince of Persia game. This could be another Tomb Raider, right? But that too proved to be a financial disappointment. And so not only were R-rated movies costing 9 figures a Hollywood no-no, all of a sudden there was the loss of confidence too in the video game movie. That could the massive audience of video games cross over into film? Well, there was precious little sign that was happening. Even against that, though, it wasn't that finally knocked this on the head, because what wasn't known at the time that contract was signed was that Ken Levine had the power to kill the Bioshock film. And this only came to light in an interview that he did with BAFTA promoting the third game in the series, Bioshock Infinite, in 2013. That the second Bioshock video game came out in 2010, although the film didn't, and another game came out by the time the story really appeared. Because in that BAFTA interview, and you can see it online, it's on YouTube, he said they brought another director in and I didn't really see the match there. And 2K, or Take-Two, is one of those companies that puts a lot of creative trust in people. So they said, if you want to kill it, kill it. And I killed it. And in the end, it was as simple as that. As Levine went on to say, it was saying, I don't need to compromise. How many times in life do you not need to compromise? It comes along so rarely, he said, but I had the world existed, and I didn't want to see it done in a way that I didn't think was right. It may happen one day, who knows, but it'd have to be the right combination of people. Verbinski, he added, didn't want to do it as an $80 million movie outside of the US. He couldn't do it that way. Levine thus pulled the plug on Bioshock. Around the same time, it's worth noting as well that Guillermo del Toro was trying to bring one of his passion projects, At the Mountains of Madness, to the big screen, and it's the same problem. R-rated movie, it was in Universal's in tray after Warner was passed. It was going to cost 9 figures to make, and Universal just didn't have the confidence it would get its money back. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Bioshock movie, and the rights have now reverted back, well, Verbinski would actually go on to win an Oscar for Rango. He would then move to 20th Century Fox to make his next film, A Cure for Wellness. Script leaks have reportedly appeared on the internet, and there are one or two people who reckon they've seen the Bioshock movie script, but it remains one of those great unmade movies. However, there have been some green shoots that Greg Russo, who's involved with the upcoming Mortal Kombat film at the point this podcast has been recorded, says he's one of those who said he fancies having a go at a Bioshock movie. And there's a feeling, and Gore Verbinski said this more recently, that it's the kind of film that actually probably could get made now, that the technology required to make it is cheaper for a start, and also the films like Deadpool have shown that you can have an R rating and still make an absolute packet of money. What we're left with, though, from Verbinski's attempt to bring Bioshock to the screen was an awful lot of concept art has leaked out over the past few years, and there's occasional talk of another Bioshock movie project just coming up, but there've been lots of changes. I mean, Ken Levine is no longer with Irrational Games anymore. Irrational Games closed down, and so Levine's gone off to work for to basically put together and make his games with a smaller studio where he has a bit more wiggle room, really. The rights to Bioshock have remained with 2K Games, Take-Two Entertainment, and so if anything's going to happen with a Bioshock movie, it's going to come from there. The Witch has just had a successful run on Netflix. That may yet be the way forward for something like this, but as it stands, for all the toing and froing, for all the talk about how Bioshock, there's no way it's going to go the same way as the Halo movie, well, went the same way as the Halo movie. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of the Film Stories podcast. Thanks again to the wonderful folks at Mutiny Shaving, hashtag, of course, join the Mutiny, for their support of this podcast. Thank you as well. If you want more of my waffling, I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew. If you want to sponsor this podcast or get in touch, I'm Simon at filmstories.co.uk. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. The website at filmstories.co.uk is updated every weekday with features, with reviews, with news stories, and that's really been building up. And thank you so much for your support of that. And then there's our print magazines. I love print magazines. You can find more about those at store.filmstories.co.uk. And if you want to support this podcast yourself, patreon.com/Simon Brew. Oh, that's an awful lot of web links to remember, isn't it? Main thing is, though, in the midst of what we're still going through in the world at the point this has been recorded, you all stay safe and well and look after yourselves. I can't thank you enough for your continued support of this podcast, and I'll be back with you soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all take care. Bye bye.
You're so cool. You're so cool. You're so cool.